Look at that flying barrel. One Italian mechanic sneered, his voice carrying across the cracked concrete of a southern airfield in early 1944. A few pilots chuckled. Others leaned back against the fuselage of their sleek Macchi fighters, crossing their arms with an air of superiority. Before them, parked at the edge of the tarmac, sat the American newcomer, a bent-winged monster, its massive propeller glinting in the fading sun. It was unlike anything they had seen before. Awkward. Bulky. To their eyes, ugly beyond redemption. Surely, they thought, this machine could never rival the elegant lines of an Italian fighter. But wars are rarely decided by elegance. The laughter echoed off the hangars, the kind of laughter soldiers used to mask unease. Beneath the jokes was a deeper question. What sort of beast had the Allies unleashed? That strange silhouette, that oversized engine, those stubby wings, could something so grotesque truly be dangerous? Or had American engineers finally overreached, building a machine more absurd than effective? It is here, in this moment of ridicule, that the story of the Corsair in the Mediterranean begins. A story not of beauty but of brute force. Not of maneuvering duels but of a shift in air combat itself. And as you'll soon hear, those who dismissed the Corsair's appearance would pay for their arrogance with fire and steel. Before we dive into this sweeping story of machines and men, I want to welcome you to our channel. Here we breathe life into the shadows of the Second World War. If you're someone who loves to peel back the myths and discover the human drama behind the statistics, you're in the right place. Make sure you subscribe, not just to keep up with our latest deep dive episodes, but to help us continue uncovering the forgotten corners of history. And if you find yourself caught up in today's story, if you can almost hear the roar of engines above the Adriatic or feel the tremor of .50 caliber guns, consider liking this video. It tells us that these long-form journeys through the past matter to you. Because what we're about to explore isn't just about airplanes. It's about the clash of cultures and philosophies in the air war. It's about how perception, pride, and technology collided at 20,000 feet. And it's about how a machine mocked for its looks became a nightmare whispered about in Italian ready rooms, the blue devil of the skies. So settle in. Imagine yourself on that cracked airfield, the laughter still hanging in the winter air. The sun dips low, painting the bent wings in blood-red light. Soon, those who laugh will find themselves hunted, their mocking words drowned out by the thunder of 6 heavy guns. And that's where our story begins. The winter of 1944 clung stubbornly to the southern coasts of Italy. The nights were damp and cold, the days carried the smell of smoke and oil drifting from bombed-out factories. Along the Adriatic airfields, the cracked runways bore scars of repeated raids, patched hastily with gravel and wooden planks. In the mess halls, young pilots warmed their hands around tin cups of bitter coffee substitutes, speaking in hushed tones about the war that seemed to be slipping away from them. Italy was fractured. The North, under German occupation, pressed pilots into service with the Luftwaffe. The South, under Allied control, was a staging ground for relentless bombing campaigns aimed at crippling Axis supply lines. The middle ground, where Italian squadrons still tried to hold the line, was shrinking by the week. And in that shrinking space, the pilots clung to their pride, their machines, and the fading belief that their skill in the cockpit could still turn the tide. The Regia Aeronautica, once a symbol of fascist ambition, was a shadow of itself. Its squadrons had bled men and machines for nearly 5 years. Many of its best pilots had been lost over Malta, in North Africa, and across the Mediterranean convoys. Fuel was rationed. Spare parts arrived late if at all. Yet, despite the shortages, the Italian fighter pilots still carried themselves with the swagger of knights of the air. They flew machines that were, at least in form, works of art. Take the Macchi C.202 for instance. To the untrained eye, it looked like the embodiment of grace. Sleek fuselage, long nose, slender wings that curved gently into the horizon. Its engine, built under license from Germany's Daimler-Benz, gave it power and agility that rivaled early Spitfires. In the summer of 1942, it was feared, even respected. Allied pilots who had tangled with the Folgore, the Thunderbolt, remembered how quickly it could twist and climb, how gracefully it could turn. But by 1944 the skies were different. The Americans were arriving in greater numbers. They brought machines heavier, faster, more heavily armed than anything Italian factories could dream of producing at that stage of the war. The P-38 Lightning with its twin booms. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a flying anvil with a radial engine that could soak up punishment. And soon, something stranger still, the F4U Corsair, a creature that seemed born from another world. The Corsair did not whisper grace. It roared brute strength. Its wings bent sharply downward before curling back up, a strange gull-wing design that baffled those who first saw it. Its nose was dominated by a massive propeller driven by an engine so large that ground crews joked it could pull a freight train. Where the Macchi looked like a racehorse, the Corsair looked like a bull. A bull with wings. It was not beauty. It was intimidation in metal form. Yet Italian pilots laughed. They laughed because laughter is easier than fear. They told each other that such a machine could not possibly outmaneuver them. That its bulk would make it clumsy, its awkward frame a coffin for any pilot who dared to turn with a Falgor. They reassured themselves that skill, training, and tradition were worth more than brute horsepower. After all, wasn't the art of the dogfight a matter of finesse? Of instinct, timing, and grace? But deep down, some felt the unease. They had seen what American firepower could do. They had seen bombers carve cities apart. They had heard stories from German allies about new fighters arriving in the Pacific, machines that defied expectations and chewed through Japanese veterans. They just didn't want to believe it was coming to their own skies. What they didn't yet realize was that the Corsair represented more than another fighter. It was the herald of a new philosophy of aerial combat. For decades, air war had been imagined as duels, knights tilting lances in the open sky, circling and wheeling until one fell in flames. The Corsair came with a different vision. Hit hard, hit fast, and climb away before the enemy could blink. A philosophy of energy fighting, of exploiting speed and altitude rather than dancing in elegant circles. This was not the war the Italians had trained for. This was not the war their sleek machines were built to fight. And soon, they would learn the cost of underestimating an enemy that valued results over appearances. In the ready rooms, pilots of the Regia Aeronautica kept their bravado alive. They spoke of duels to come, of showing these Americans what true flying skill looked like. They polished their boots, straightened their scarves, and carried themselves as heirs to the knights of the Renaissance. Pride was their fuel when aviation gas ran short. And on the far side of the Mediterranean, American crews readied their bent-wing beasts for deployment. They greased the landing gear, checked the oil lines, and loaded belts of .50 caliber ammunition into the wings, belts that stretched so far they seemed endless. Each bullet the size of a man's finger, each capable of tearing through armor and flesh alike. The Corsair was almost ready to take its place in Europe's skies. The stage was set, elegance against brutality, tradition against innovation, pride against power. And in that clash, history would not favor the beautiful. Long before the Corsair cast its shadow over Mediterranean airfields, it was born in the minds of American engineers staring at a blank sheet of paper in 1938. The U.S. Navy had issued a challenge that seemed almost impossible. Build a fighter that could outpace every aircraft in the world, climb higher, strike harder, and, most importantly, take off and land on the deck of a carrier. It was a tall order in an era when most carrier fighters still looked and performed like biplanes with enclosed cockpits. The design that emerged from Vaught's engineers was nothing short of audacious. At its heart lay an engine so massive that it seemed to belong in a bomber rather than a single-seat fighter. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. With 18 cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows, it promised over 2,000 horsepower, a staggering figure at the time. To translate that raw power into thrust, the engineers fitted a propeller more than 13 feet in diameter. It was the largest propeller ever mounted on a fighter. This combination created an immediate problem. The propeller was so big that if mounted on a traditional airframe, its blades would strike the deck during takeoff. The solution would have to be as radical as the engine itself. After weeks of sketches and arguments, one engineer proposed an idea that sounded absurd at first. Bend the wings. By angling the wings downward from the fuselage before curving them back up, the landing gear could be shortened and strengthened, while still leaving clearance for the gigantic propeller. The result was a silhouette that looked nothing like the graceful lines of a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt. The Corsair's wings were crooked, its nose long and bulbous, its canopy set back behind that engine like an afterthought. Yet every curve, every bend served a purpose. In flight, the Corsair was a revelation. Early test flights shattered speed records, pushing past 400 miles per hour in level flight, a figure that outclassed anything the Navy had ever fielded. In dives it could exceed 500. Pilots described the engine's roar as a thunderclap that vibrated through the very bones of the fuselage. The gull wings sliced through the air, and the big fighter responded with surprising grace when handled properly. But grace was relative. On the carrier decks it proved a nightmare. The long nose blocked visibility during landing approaches. The aircraft had a tendency to stall on one wing at low speeds, dropping suddenly and unpredictably. Pilots cursed it, calling it the ensign eliminator, after several accidents during trials. For a time, the Navy considered scrapping the idea altogether, turning instead to safer, slower alternatives. It was the Marines who saved the Corsair. Unlike the Navy, they didn't demand perfect carrier handling at the outset. They needed speed, firepower, and ruggedness for brutal battles over island jungles and coral atolls. And in those arenas the Corsair excelled. Armed with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing, the fighter carried enough ammunition to unleash a storm of metal for nearly 2 minutes of sustained fire. Pilots soon learned that just a 3-second burst could shred a bomber to ribbons or snap the wings off an enemy fighter. The firepower was overwhelming, a floating arsenal of steel. By 1943, the Corsair was already earning a deadly reputation in the Pacific. Japanese pilots who had once danced circles around American Wildcats suddenly found themselves torn from the sky by a machine that climbed faster, dove harder, and soaked up punishment without flinching. In just a few months, Marine squadrons racked up kill ratios that bordered on the unbelievable. Reports claimed as many as 10 enemy aircraft destroyed for every Corsair lost. But the Corsair's greatest impact was not just in numbers. It forced a new way of thinking. Dogfighting had always been imagined as a contest of agility, but the Corsair redefined the game. Its pilots didn't need to outturn opponents. They used speed to dictate the fight, swooping down like hawks, unleashing fire, then climbing away before anyone could answer. This philosophy of boom and zoom was a natural extension of the Corsair's design. With that massive engine and heavy frame, it carried momentum like a freight train in the sky. Once it built up speed, nothing Italian or German could match its acceleration. And with armor plating around the cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks, it could shrug off hits that would cripple lighter European designs. Still, when whispers of the Corsair reached Europe, skepticism reigned. To pilots raised on tales of elegant duels and knife-edge turns, the machine seemed crude. Its bent wings were mocked as clumsy. Its size made it look more like a ground attack plane than a fighter. Surely, they thought, the Americans had traded agility for brute force. And in the tradition of aerial knights, wasn't agility the soul of combat? This was the crux of the coming clash, two visions of air war colliding. On one side, the Italians with their beautiful but aging fighters, clinging to the romance of turning battles. On the other, the Americans, bringing forth a beast born not of beauty but of necessity, a machine built to dominate through power and overwhelming fire. The Corsair was more than an aircraft. It was a warning that the era of chivalry in the sky was ending. Those who laughed at its appearance would soon discover that its strange silhouette was the shape of the future. And as 1944 wore on, the future came roaring across the Mediterranean, its bent wings gleaming in the sun, its guns loaded with thunder. The morning sky over the Adriatic was pale blue, streaked with thin clouds that glowed in the rising sun. At a forward Italian airfield, ground crews worked quickly, refueling Macchi C.205 Veltros and checking their ammunition belts. The smell of gasoline mixed with the sharper tang of cordite as mechanics tugged heavy machine gun drums into place. Pilots adjusted their flight jackets, some whistling nervously, others silent, lost in their thoughts. The briefing had been simple: intercept an Allied patrol skirting the coast. Intelligence suggested P-38 Lightnings, perhaps Thunderbolts. Dangerous, yes, but familiar foes. The men had faced both before. They knew their weaknesses, their strengths, and their own machines well enough to believe they could survive the day. What they did not know was that this patrol included something new. Something few Italians had ever seen up close. Engines roared to life, coughing smoke before settling into steady thunder. One by one, the Macchis rolled onto the runway, their slender frames lifting gracefully into the cool morning air. From the ground, the sight was almost reassuring. Slim silhouettes climbing like arrows into the sky. To watch them, you could almost forget the shortages, the fatigue, the creeping sense that the war was slipping away. For a few minutes, the Italian pilots once again looked like the lords of the air. At altitude, they formed up, sunlight glinting off canopies. Then came the first radio call. Contact. 11 o'clock high. Shadows appeared against the brightness, dark forms growing larger by the second. At first glance, they looked like thunderbolts, their broad wings unmistakable. But as they drew nearer, the shapes resolved into something stranger. Wings bent downward, then sharply upward. A nose so long it seemed to stretch toward the horizon. The Italian pilots blinked, confused. This was no lightning, no jug. This was something else entirely. Laughter crackled across the radios. One pilot joked that the Americans had brought along their bombers by mistake. Another muttered that the machines looked clumsy, like beetles trying to fly. Confidence surged. Ugly aircraft were slow aircraft, or so they told themselves. But then the Corsairs opened their throttles. The sound was overwhelming, a deep, thunderous roar that seemed to split the very sky. The bent-wing beasts closed the distance with terrifying speed, their massive propellers carving the air into white streaks. Before the Italians could react, the first Corsair was upon them. A burst of 6.50 caliber guns lit the morning. The air filled with glowing tracers, arcing lines of fire that converged on a Macchi caught in mid-climb. The Italian fighter shuddered violently, pieces of its wing erupting in sparks. In seconds, the elegant machine disintegrated, spiraling downward in smoke and flame. The laughter stopped. Chaos erupted. Italian pilots pulled hard into turns, trying to bring their nimble fighters around. The Corsairs did not follow. They didn't need to. Instead, they climbed, looped wide, and dove again with murderous precision. Each attack was swift and brutal. A dive, a burst, a climb. No circling duels, no prolonged dances of maneuver. Just raw power, delivered with surgical cruelty. One Italian, Lieutenant Carlo B., yanked his Macchi into a tight spiral, hoping to lure the strange American fighter into a turning contest. For a moment he thought it was working. The Corsair flashed past, overshooting. He rolled hard, lined up his guns, and prepared to fire. But the American didn't turn back. Instead, it rocketed upward, leaving Carlo's lighter machine straining hopelessly to follow. Seconds later, the Corsair came screaming down from above. Carlo jerked his stick desperately, but the tracers found him. Witnesses later recalled the brief flash of fire before his aircraft vanished into the sea. The Italians were stunned. Every instinct told them the Americans would fight as before, turn for turn, climb for climb. But the Corsairs rewrote the script. They refused the duel. They dictated the fight, choosing when to engage and when to vanish into the sun. Radio chatter grew frantic. "They dive too fast," one pilot cried. "Impossible to follow." Another shouted, "They climb like demons." Within minutes, the skirmish had turned one-sided. For every Macchi that managed to fire a burst, two more were cut apart by streams of .50 caliber rounds. The sound of gunfire echoed in the cockpits, a staccato thunder that seemed endless. Pilots who survived later spoke of the terror of those guns, the way the tracers seemed to multiply, as if the Corsair carried more firepower than physics should allow. And in truth it did. 6 heavy Brownings, each firing nearly 800 rounds per minute, meant that in a single pass, a Corsair could unleash more than 70 bullets per second. Against lightly built Italian fighters, a 2-second burst was enough to end the fight. By the time the Americans turned back toward their base, the sky was littered with black smoke trails. Several Italian fighters failed to return. The survivors landed in silence, engines sputtering, wings riddled with holes. Mechanics counted the scars with wide eyes, muttering about calibers too large, too merciless. That night, in the mess halls, no one laughed about the Corsair. Instead, they whispered about its speed, its claws of fire, its refusal to fight by the old rules. The bent wings that had seemed comical now looked like the silhouette of death itself. And so began the legend, the Blue Devil, the beast that turned ridicule into fear. The days that followed that first clash were heavy with silence. On the ground, the airfields carried an unease that words could not mask. Mechanics still joked as they worked, but their voices were quieter now, their laughter strained. Pilots sharpened pencils over maps, tracing routes and fuel limits, but their hands sometimes lingered too long on the edges of their coffee mugs. The Corsair had become more than an enemy aircraft, it had become a shadow in their thoughts. On paper, the Macchi C.205 Veltro was still a fine fighter. Its Daimler-Benz U-derived engine gave it power enough to match Allied aircraft in a climb. Its handling was crisp, its frame sturdy. In a turning contest, it could embarrass many opponents. Yet, none of that seemed to matter against the new American arrival. The Corsair refused to play the same game. Consider one encounter over the Tyrrhenian Sea. A formation of 6 Italian fighters had been dispatched to intercept what they believed to be a reconnaissance flight. The weather was clear, the sea below glinting like hammered steel. At altitude, the Italians spread into combat formation, scanning the horizon. Then they saw them, 4 dark specks, distant at first, then growing rapidly. The Italians expected lightnings or thunderbolts, and they tightened their formation accordingly. But as the shapes grew larger, the dread returned. Bent wings. Long nose. That unmistakable silhouette. The squadron leader gave the order to engage, determined not to let fear rule the moment. The Italians dove, closing the distance quickly. For a few seconds they felt the old thrill, air rushing past the canopy, the nose pointed at prey. But the prey turned hunter in an instant. The Corsairs broke formation with practiced precision, climbing steeply before wheeling down like hawks. Their dives were faster than anything the Italians had trained against. One Corsair passed through the formation, guns blazing, and in the blink of an eye one of the Macchis disintegrated, its wings sheared away by a storm of .50 caliber fire. The rest scattered. One Italian rolled sharply to the right, pulling his machine into a desperate dive. His altimeter spun wildly as the sea rushed up to meet him. Behind, he caught glimpses of the Corsair, its wings flashing silver in the sun, growing larger. He yanked the stick, forcing the Macchi into a punishing turn. For a heartbeat he thought he had escaped. The Corsair overshot, streaking past like a meteor. Relief surged. Then came the realization. The American was climbing again, already arcing for another strike. The Italian's engine strained, his aircraft sluggish from the violent maneuver. By the time the Corsair came diving once more, he had nothing left to give. Tracers slashed past his canopy. The sea filled his vision. He bailed out at the last possible moment, his parachute opening like a pale flower against the steel-gray water. He lived. But his comrades were not so lucky. Stories like this spread quickly. Pilots spoke in half-whispers about the American guns, about how they fired without pause, as though the Corsair carried an endless supply of ammunition. Others spoke of the way the aircraft seemed to shrug off return fire. "I hit him," one pilot insisted, his hands trembling as he tried to explain. "I hit him with everything I had. He just climbed away as if nothing touched him." It wasn't just the physical dominance, it was the psychological one. The Italians were used to duels, contests of skill where pilot met pilot on near equal terms. But the Corsair did not duel. It hunted. It chose its moment, struck like lightning, and vanished into the sun. There was no conversation in the sky, no back-and-forth exchange. Only ambush and devastation. This new reality forced Italian commanders to reconsider tactics. Orders went out. Avoid climbing duels, avoid head-on passes, and above all, avoid being caught alone. Strength in numbers, they said. But numbers were dwindling. Fuel shortages meant fewer sorties. Losses meant fewer veterans to lead the inexperienced. And every time a Corsair appeared, the sense of inevitability deepened. In the evenings, the pilots gathered in their quarters. Cigarette smoke curled toward the rafters, mingling with the drone of distant bombers. Some tried to put on brave faces, telling stories of narrow escapes, exaggerating their near victories. Others stayed quiet, staring at the floorboards, replaying the thunder of guns in their heads. One young pilot scribbled in his diary, "They laughed at the wings. I laughed too. Now I only hear them in my dreams, that roar, those guns. We are not fighting men anymore, we are fighting machines." Even the Germans, who had long prided themselves on their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, began to respect the Corsair's presence. Rumors spread through Luftwaffe circles about a naval fighter that could climb like a devil and dive like a stone. Some dismissed it, insisting it was exaggerated propaganda. But those who had seen the bent wings up close were less certain. For the Italians, who had once carried themselves as heirs of chivalry in the sky, the encounters were crushing. Pride, that last reserve of strength, was eroding. The Corsair was not just defeating them in battle, it was rewriting the very rules of combat. And yet, for all the fear, the Italians kept flying. They had little choice. Orders came, missions were assigned, and the war pressed on. Some hoped they might one day find the Corsair's weakness. Others prayed they would simply never meet one again. But the war did not grant them such mercy. Each week, the bent-wing beasts appeared more frequently. Each week, more pilots failed to return. The laughter that had once echoed across the airfields was gone, replaced by silence heavy enough to be felt. In that silence, the Corsair's legend grew. Not as a machine of elegance, but as a specter, a reminder that the age of beauty in the skies was ending, and the age of brute force had arrived. By the spring of 1944, the Corsair was no longer an oddity whispered about in Italian ready rooms. It was becoming a regular presence in the skies. At first, it appeared in small patrols, a handful of aircraft shadowing bomber formations or sweeping the coasts. But gradually their numbers grew. Soon they were not just escorts. They were hunters. The Allies had learned a lesson from years of costly air campaigns. Attrition was as much a weapon as bullets. For every Italian aircraft destroyed in the sky, 3 more might be grounded for lack of parts or fuel. And for every pilot killed, an irreplaceable investment of skill and training vanished. The Corsair, with its speed, range, and devastating armament, was the perfect tool for this strategy of pressure. American commanders began to assign Corsair squadrons to what they called free hunts. These missions were simple in concept but devastating in execution. Sweep ahead of bomber streams, scour the skies for enemy patrols, and engage on favorable terms. There was no requirement to protect a specific target, no burden of staying close to slower bombers. The Corsairs were unleashed to do what they did best: dictate the fight. One such sweep took place over the Ligurian coast. Italian radar stations had picked up incoming aircraft, and a flight of fighters scrambled to intercept. They climbed into a clear morning, their engines laboring as they gained altitude. The sea below was calm, the coastline stretching like a jagged scar. The Italians spotted movement ahead, silhouettes against the sun. Once again they hoped for bombers or familiar thunderbolts. But the shapes resolved into bent wings, glinting silver and blue. The pilots swallowed their fear and pressed on. Pride demanded it. The clash was brutal. The Corsairs came in from above, their speed astonishing. One Italian later recalled, "They were not flying toward us. They were falling toward us. Like stones thrown from heaven." Tracers slashed the sky. The Italians tried to scatter, but the Americans stayed disciplined. They struck in pairs, one diving through the formation while the other covered his partner. Then they climbed together, regrouped, and struck again. It was systematic, relentless. The Italians, skilled in turning fights, tried to drag the Americans into tight spirals. But the Corsairs refused. They zoomed upward, always keeping the advantage of altitude, always attacking on their own terms. One by one Italian fighters fell. Some spiraled into the sea, others burst into flames before hitting the ground. By the end of the skirmish, only a handful of Italians limped back to their airfield. The survivors were pale, shaken. Their aircraft bore holes large enough to crawl through. Mechanics examined the damage and shook their heads. These machines had not been shot down by luck. They had been torn apart. It wasn't just the losses themselves that ate at morale, it was the manner of those losses. Italian pilots were trained to believe in skill, in the art of maneuver, in personal courage. But the Corsair stripped away that faith. No matter how well they turned, no matter how bravely they fought, the Americans simply refused to meet them on equal ground. The effect spread beyond the cockpit. Ground crews who once took pride in patching up their sleek Mackeys began to wonder if it was worth the effort. Commanders struggled to give stirring speeches when their men returned defeated time and again. Even civilians who caught glimpses of dogfights overhead began to whisper that the Americans had machines no mortal pilot could resist. The Corsair became a symbol, and symbols cut deeper than statistics. Its bent wings, once mocked, were now recognized instantly, a silhouette that froze blood. Children in occupied towns pointed upward and shouted, "Diavolo Blue! The Blue Devil!" The Allies understood the value of this psychological dominance. They began to deploy the Corsair not just in combat but in shows of force. Squadrons would roar low over Italian positions, engines bellowing, wings flashing. They rarely fired a shot in these passes. They didn't need to. The message was clear: we own the skies. The Italians tried countermeasures. Some squadrons shifted to dawn or dusk patrols, hoping to avoid encounters. Others attempted mass formations, reasoning that numbers might offset the Corsair's advantages. But shortages undermined every plan. Fuel was scarce, spare parts scarcer still. Engines failed, radios malfunctioned, landing gear collapsed. The Regia Aeronautica was bleeding to death even without enemy fire, and the Corsair was the blade that cut deepest. Pilots began to record their fears in private. One letter, never delivered, read, "We go up as lions but return as ghosts. The sky no longer belongs to us. It belongs to the machine with bent wings." And yet, despite the despair, the Italians continued to fly. Some out of duty, others out of fatalism, and a few out of sheer defiance. They knew the odds, but pride is a stubborn companion. Perhaps they told themselves one day they would find the Corsair's flaw. But the flaw never came. Instead, with each passing week, the Corsair grew more familiar, more feared, more inevitable. It was no longer just a weapon of war. It had become a force of nature in Italian eyes, a storm that could not be resisted, only endured. The summer of 1944 brought no relief. If anything, the skies grew heavier with Allied presence. The Corsair was no longer a rare visitor, it was a constant shadow, a predator circling above every Italian mission. For pilots of the Regia Aeronautica, the war in the air had shifted from duels of honor to something closer to survival. Missions were assigned with the same formality as before. Briefings were held, maps unrolled, altitudes and vectors calculated. But beneath the formality lay dread. Every sortie carried the unspoken question: would today be the day we meet the bent wings again? They always seemed to appear when least expected. Sometimes they would emerge out of the sun, descending with a roar that rattled cockpits. Other times, they lingered high above, waiting for the Italians to climb, before swooping down with merciless precision. There was no pattern, no rhythm. Only the certainty that, sooner or later, the Corsairs would come. One afternoon, near the coast of Sardinia, a squadron of Italian fighters was dispatched to intercept Allied bombers. The bombers never appeared. Instead, 8 Corsairs slid out of the horizon. The Italians broke formation immediately, each man instinctively maneuvering for a turning fight. It was futile. The Americans climbed steeply, circled above, and then dove as a pack. Captain Lorenzo M., a veteran with dozens of missions, described what it felt like. It was as if the sea itself had risen into the sky. They came down with such weight, such fury that you could feel the air shudder. His Macchi twisted hard, the controls biting into his arms, but the Corsair never followed his turn. Instead, it screamed past, guns blazing, then arced back into the heavens. Moments later, another fell upon him from above. Lorenzo survived, barely, limping back to base with holes punched clean through his wings. Half his squadron never returned. What demoralized the Italians most was not the losses themselves but the inability to strike back. Against Spitfires, against P-38s, even against Thunderbolts, there was always the chance of a duel, of forcing the enemy into a mistake. Against the Corsair, that chance seemed to vanish. The Americans refused to fight by the old rules. They dictated the engagement with cold, mechanical precision. In mess halls, the conversations grew darker. Pilots spoke of comrades who had vanished without trace, their aircraft swallowed by the sea. They spoke of the Corsair's guns, of the endless rain of tracers, of the strange calmness with which the Americans fought. It was not a contest of men, they said. It was a slaughter conducted by machines. One young pilot, barely 20, confessed after a mission, "When I saw the bent wings above me, I felt something break inside. I did not want to fight. I only wanted to live." He said it quietly, ashamed, but others nodded. They understood. The bravado that had once filled their ready rooms was gone, replaced by an honesty too heavy to carry aloud. Commanders tried to stem the tide of despair. They reminded their men of tradition, of the honor of defending their homeland. They invoked the names of aces who had once held the skies. But the words rang hollow. The pilots knew that tradition could not climb as fast as a Corsair. Honor could not outrun a burst of 6 heavy guns. Meanwhile, Allied strategy pressed the advantage. The Corsair's range allowed it to patrol deeper and longer than most Italian fighters could sustain. Airfields that once felt secure were suddenly under constant threat. Even on the ground, men felt vulnerable. Corsairs would roar overhead on low passes, their engines hammering the earth, shaking windows and loosening tiles from rooftops. They rarely fired, but the message was unmistakable: nowhere was safe. For the Italian public, the bent-wing silhouette became infamous. Farmers working their fields would stop and stare as the dark forms streaked overhead. Children pointed skyward, calling them demons. Even soldiers on the ground, hardened by years of war, admitted to a peculiar dread when the Corsairs passed by. It was not just another enemy aircraft, it was a reminder that Allied power was overwhelming, that resistance was crumbling. And yet the Italians kept flying. Perhaps it was courage. Perhaps it was duty. Perhaps it was resignation. Each mission was a gamble, a throw of the dice against impossible odds. Some went aloft with quiet prayers, others with clenched jaws and nothing left to lose. On one mission late that summer, an Italian pilot named Riccardo found himself alone after his squadron scattered under Corsair attack. He dove toward the sea, his engine howling, the horizon tilting wildly. Behind him, a Corsair followed, tracers snapping past his canopy. Riccardo pushed his machine to its limits, the wings trembling on the edge of collapse. Somehow he escaped, barely, fuel nearly gone, nerves shattered. He returned to base shaking, unable to unclench his hands from the controls. "I escaped the devil today," he muttered as he climbed down. But tomorrow he will be waiting again. Stories like his circulated, feeding the legend. The Corsair was no longer seen as just a machine of war. It was spoken of as though it had a personality, a will of its own. The Italians gave it names: the Bent Wing, the Blue Devil, the Beast. These names carried both hatred and awe. They cursed it, but they also feared it. By the end of the summer, the laughter that had once greeted the Corsair's appearance was a distant memory. In its place was a silence heavy with inevitability. Pride had been broken. Faith in tradition had been shattered. The pilots who once considered themselves knights of the air now felt like prey, hunted by a creature they could neither match nor escape. And still the Corsairs came, day after day, their bent wings gleaming in the sun, their guns ready to speak. By the autumn of 1944, the skies above Italy no longer belonged to the Italians. The Corsair had taken more than airfields and aircraft, it had stolen the very spirit of the fighter squadrons that remained. Pilots spoke less, moved slower, and carried themselves with a weariness far beyond their years. Their uniforms were the same, their machines still bore the proud roundels of their air force, but the fire was gone. Once they had charged into combat with reckless courage, eager to match wits against any adversary. Now they climbed into their cockpits with the grim determination of men walking to the gallows. It wasn't just the losses. Every air force loses aircraft in war. It was the manner of those losses. Against the Corsair, defeat was sudden, brutal, and absolute. There was no drawn-out duel, no chance to maneuver into a position of advantage. The Americans arrived fast, struck hard, and were gone before most Italians had even touched their triggers. How does one fight such an enemy? How does one prepare to meet a foe who refuses to play by the rules you've mastered? The Corsair's dominance also changed the rhythm of Italian air operations. Missions had to be planned around rumors of its presence. If reconnaissance reported Corsairs in the area, commanders hesitated to send up fighters at all. And when they did, the men often flew with one eye on the horizon, nerves stretched taut, waiting for the dreaded silhouette to appear. At night in the barracks, stories spread like wildfire. Some swore the Corsair could climb like a rocket, others that it could dive faster than gravity itself. A few insisted it carried armor so thick that bullets simply bounced off. Much of this was exaggeration, but exaggeration was beside the point. Fear magnified every strength, turned every rumor into an unshakable truth. One veteran pilot, gray at the temples though not yet 40, was overheard telling a younger comrade, "Do not chase them. Do not turn with them. If you see them, pray the sea is nearby and dive for it." That was his advice after years of flying. Not tactics, not courage, just survival. Meanwhile, Allied pilots felt the change. They could see it in the way Italians broke early, scattered, or fled at the first hint of an engagement. For the Corsair squadrons, it was confirmation that their machine was not only winning battles in the sky but also eroding the will of their opponents on the ground. The Corsair itself seemed to embody this psychological edge. Its broad nose gave it a predatory profile. Its bent wings, once mocked, now appeared like talons spread wide. Its engine, a deep, thunderous growl, carried far across valleys and coastlines. To those below, it was not the sound of an aircraft, it was the sound of inevitability, of something massive and unstoppable approaching. On the ground, Italian civilians learned to recognize the Corsair as well. Farmers paused their work as one thundered overhead, watching with a mixture of fear and resignation. Children pointed skyward, their games momentarily halted by the sight of the bent-winged bird. Soldiers looked up with unease, muttering curses under their breath. Even without firing a shot, the Corsair could command attention, could make men feel small. Allied commanders understood this effect and leaned into it. Corsairs were sometimes dispatched on patrols with no specific mission beyond visibility. They circled enemy airfields, roared across railway lines, and swept low over convoys. Their mere presence tied down Italian fighters, disrupted schedules, and spread fatigue. Each time the bent wings appeared, men braced for attack, even if none came. And when the attacks did come, they were devastating. One Corsair squadron, operating from newly captured bases, developed a reputation for lightning raids. They would strike airfields at dawn, engines screaming low over the runways, their guns raking parked aircraft. Mechanics scrambled for cover, pilots sprinted for dispersal areas, but there was little to be done. Within minutes, hangars burned, fuel stores exploded, and the Corsairs were gone, leaving only wreckage and silence behind. Italian commanders protested that such raids were cowardly, unworthy of proper fighters. But even they knew the truth. The Corsair represented a new way of war, one where results mattered more than appearances, where efficiency replaced tradition. As weeks turned into months, Italian losses mounted. For every Corsair downed, and there were some, for even the most advanced aircraft could fall, the Italians lost many more. Ratios of 5-1, even 10-1, were whispered in staff rooms. If such numbers held, the Air Force could not last. And deep down, everyone knew it. In one particularly grim engagement, a mixed group of Italian fighters attempted to intercept a formation of Allied bombers near Florence. They never reached the bombers. A wall of Corsairs intercepted them, climbing like phantoms out of the haze. The Italians fought desperately, twisting and turning, but the Americans cut through them with ruthless precision. In less than 15 minutes, half the formation was gone. The rest fled, scattered across the sky. When the survivors landed, shaken and silent, their commander paced the tarmac in fury. "You will fight," he barked. "You will not run from the enemy." But his words felt hollow, bouncing off men who had already seen the truth. They could not fight what they could not match. The Corsair had become more than a weapon of steel. It was a weapon of the mind. Every sighting, every story, every echo of its engine carried weight far beyond the physical battlefield. And this was the essence of its power. It did not merely destroy aircraft. It destroyed confidence. In this way, the laughter that once greeted its ungainly form had turned full circle. What was once mocked as a flying bathtub had become the very face of terror in the skies. And the Italians, who had once sworn they would dance circles around it, now dreaded nothing more than the sight of those bent wings cutting through the sunlight. The war in the air was no longer a contest of equals. It was a relentless lesson in modernity, in the ruthless efficiency of American engineering and doctrine. The Italians were learning it the hardest way possible. One sortie at a time, one loss after another, until the weight of inevitability crushed the very idea of resistance. By late 1944, the Italian Air Force was a shadow of its former self. Aircraft sat idle for lack of parts. Fuel was rationed so heavily that training flights became rare luxuries. Even when missions were ordered, only a fraction of the assigned planes could actually take off. The proud fighter squadrons that had once roared into the sky in tight formations now lifted off in 2s and 3s, their ranks thinned by losses and shortages alike. And always, overhead, the Corsair waited. There was no need for Allied intelligence to track every Italian unit. The pattern of exhaustion was obvious. Pilots were stretched thin, machines barely held together, and morale had collapsed under the weight of constant defeats. The Americans knew that every time a Corsair squadron took to the sky, it was not just intercepting aircraft, it was hammering away at what little resolve the Italians had left. In one of the final major encounters, a small group of Italian fighters scrambled from a battered airfield outside Bologna. The alarm had sounded, enemy aircraft were inbound. Engines coughed to life, belching smoke as mechanics shoved blocks from under wheels and waved their pilots aloft. The Italians climbed into the haze, hearts pounding, radios crackling with clipped orders. For a moment there was silence, just the thrum of engines and the beating of air over wings. Then came the call. Contact. Out of the pale sky, a formation of Corsairs materialized. Their bent wings glinted like blades in the sunlight. The Italians pressed their throttles forward, trying to gain position, trying to convince themselves that this time would be different. It wasn't. The Corsairs swept down with their usual terrifying speed. Tracers filled the sky, hammering into Italian aircraft before most had even sighted their targets. One Macchi exploded instantly, a ball of fire that tumbled toward the fields below. Another broke apart midair, pieces scattering across the clouds. For the survivors there was no time to think, only to react. They pulled into desperate turns, dove toward the earth, tried every trick they knew. But the Americans would not be drawn into their spirals. They climbed instead, soaring high before pitching down again in near vertical dives. Each pass was clean, calculated, and deadly. One Italian pilot, barely 19 years old, later described what he saw. They fell upon us like hawks on pigeons. There was no fight. There was only running and dying. His words captured the essence of those final months. The few who made it back landed on runways pitted with bomb craters, their machines riddled with holes. Mechanics shook their heads in disbelief. Some aircraft had taken damage so severe that in earlier years they would have been declared total losses. Now they were patched together anyway. Every airframe counted, even if it could barely stay aloft. But numbers told the story best. By the winter of 1944, Italian fighter losses outstripped replacements by a wide margin. Squadrons that had once fielded 20 or 30 aircraft were lucky to muster 5. Training schools had ground to a halt, unable to fuel or maintain their machines. The pipeline of fresh pilots had dried up. And those few who graduated found themselves thrown almost immediately into hopeless combat against Corsairs and other Allied fighters. The psychological toll deepened. Diaries captured the despair with brutal honesty. One pilot wrote, "Each morning I look at the sky and know it is theirs. We fly only because we are ordered. We fight only to delay the end. The devil with bent wings is always there waiting." That phrase, "the devil with bent wings," echoed through the ranks. It was not an official nickname. It was not born in propaganda offices or painted on fuselages. It was whispered in barracks, muttered on flight lines, passed quietly from man to man. And it captured what the Corsair had become, not just an aircraft but an omen. For the Allies the effect was undeniable. The Corsair had achieved what every air commander dreams of, air superiority so absolute that the enemy no longer fought with conviction. Italian pilots flew not with confidence, but with resignation. And resignation is death in the air. Yet, amid the despair, flashes of defiance remained. There were still moments when Italian pilots refused to break, when they pressed their attacks despite the odds. In one skirmish, an Italian ace managed to line up behind a Corsair and fire. His round struck home, damaging the American's tail and forcing him to withdraw. For a brief moment, hope flared. But even that victory was hollow. Before the ace could celebrate, another Corsair swooped down and tore his aircraft apart. His comrades watched helplessly as the wreckage spiraled into the countryside. Such stories spread, but instead of inspiring, they only reinforced the futility. For every rare success the price was ruinous. The Corsair's dominance was not absolute because it was invincible. It was absolute because it was overwhelming, persistent, and backed by an Allied war machine that Italy could not match. As the front lines collapsed and the Allies pushed northward, the Italian Air Force dwindled into near irrelevance. What few aircraft remained often avoided combat altogether, staying grounded rather than risk annihilation. Corsair patrols roamed with impunity, their engines a constant reminder that the war in the air was over, even if the war on the ground still raged. And so, by the time 1945 dawned, the story had already been written. The Italian fighter arm had been broken, not just by bombs and bullets, but by the relentless weight of a machine they once laughed at. The Corsair had arrived as a curiosity, mocked for its ungainly design. It left as a legend, its silhouette burned into the memories of every man who ever looked up at the sky and prayed not to see it. The beginning of 1945 marked the final act of the air war over Italy. Snow dusted the Apennines, the rivers ran cold and swollen, and across the country, towns bore the scars of endless bombardment. But high above the shattered landscape, the Corsair still roared, relentless as ever. For the Italian fighter arm, there was nothing left of the old order. Squadrons that had once paraded proudly across runways with polished machines and confident pilots were now reduced to ragged fragments. A handful of serviceable aircraft here, a few desperate men there. When missions were ordered, they were less about strategy and more about symbolism. proof to commanders, to civilians, and perhaps even to themselves that they had not given up entirely. Yet in the skies, symbols counted for little. The Corsairs patrolled with ease, their engines echoing like drums of doom over valleys and cities. Allied ground troops spoke of the comfort they felt whenever those bent wings appeared overhead, knowing that the enemy's air claws had been blunted beyond recognition. Italian soldiers on the other side felt the opposite. The presence of the Corsair was a reminder that even their own skies no longer belonged to them. In one of the last organized sorties, a small band of Italian fighters was sent to intercept an Allied supply convoy escorted by aircraft. The pilots gathered in their briefing hut, its windows rattling from distant artillery. Their commander, a man hollow-eyed from months of strain, traced a line across a map with trembling fingers. "We will strike here," he said, though his voice betrayed no conviction. "Do your duty." They took off into gray skies, engines coughing, wings patched with fabric and hope. At altitude, their formation was ragged, uneven. But they pressed on, hearts pounding, clinging to the thin thread of pride that remained. And then the Corsairs appeared. They came not as hunters stalking prey but as executioners. Diving from altitude, they unleashed torrents of fire. One Italian fighter erupted before the others had even seen their attackers. Another tried to roll and escape, only to be cut down in a second burst. Within minutes, the sky was chaos. Radio chatter filled with desperate cries. "They are above us. I cannot shake him. God help me." The transmissions ended abruptly, cut short by gunfire or flame. A single Italian pilot, Giuseppe, survived the engagement. His engine shot out, canopy shattered, he bailed into the freezing air and drifted slowly toward the ground. Hanging beneath his parachute, he looked upward. Above him, the Corsairs wheeled gracefully, their engines thunderous, their wings gleaming even in the pale light. "They moved like gods," he later recalled. "And we were insects crushed beneath them." That description spread after the war because it captured what so many had felt in those last months. The Corsair had transcended the role of fighter. It was no longer just a machine, it was a force, a presence, something that lived in the imagination of its enemies long after the battles were done. The collapse of Italian air resistance was not simply a matter of machines destroyed. It was the destruction of belief. In the beginning, Italian pilots had believed in themselves, in their aircraft, in the traditions of aerial dueling. By the end, that belief had been ground into dust beneath the weight of American firepower and doctrine. And yet, there is a strange dignity in their final missions. They flew knowing the odds. They fought knowing they would likely lose. But still, they climbed into their cockpits, strapped themselves in, and hurled their machines into the sky. Not for victory, victory was beyond reach, but for honor, for duty, for the thin thread of pride that could not be severed even by bent wings and burning guns. Meanwhile, for the Corsair pilots, the war carried a different weight. Their machines were powerful, their tactics devastating, but they too felt the strain. Some spoke of unease, of shooting down opponents who barely seemed able to fight back. "It felt less like combat," one American pilot admitted, "and more like chasing shadows. But shadows can still kill you if you're careless." They knew their dominance was not invincibility. Flak could still rip a wing away. A lucky burst from a desperate Italian could still end a life. But the outcome was never in doubt. By early 1945, the Regia Aeronautica as a fighting force was finished. Its remnants scattered, its machines abandoned, its men grounded by shortages or surrender. And in the memories of those who survived, Italian, American, and civilian alike, one image remained seared above all others: the silhouette of the Corsair, bent wings slicing across the sun, guns ready to roar. The laughter of 1943, when Italians first mocked its ungainly form, seemed like a cruel joke by then. What had been seen as clumsy had proved elegant in its lethality. What had been dismissed as slow had revealed itself as blindingly fast in the dive. And what had been underestimated had become unstoppable. The Corsair had rewritten the story of the skies over Italy. It was the machine that taught its enemies that appearances deceive, that arrogance can be fatal, and that sometimes the most mocked design becomes the most feared. And as 1945 rolled forward and the war in Europe neared its end, the Corsair's legend only grew. For the Italians, it was the machine that broke their wings. For the Allies, it was the guardian that cleared the skies. And for history, it became one of the enduring symbols of a war where steel and fire reshaped the world. The war in Italy was burning out, but in the skies the fire raged hotter than ever. For the Italians, the last shreds of hope slipped through their fingers like sand. They had mocked the bent-winged fighter once. Now they flinched at its shadow. It was not just defeat. It was humiliation. Imagine the contrast. 2 years earlier, young Italian pilots laughing in their mess halls, calling the Corsair a mistake of American engineering. Too heavy, too clumsy, too absurd to be a fighter. And then, fast forward. Those same pilots huddled in their cockpits, scanning the skies with dry throats and trembling hands, praying not to see the bent wings appear. The irony was unbearable. The machine that was ridiculed had become the terror of their world. The Corsair did not duel. It destroyed. That was its genius. It refused the games of chivalry, the old rules of turning fights and gentlemanly engagements. It struck like a hammer, fast, ruthless, and final. And in that, it broke not just machines but minds. One Italian ace confessed after the war, "We could not fight them as men. They fought as predators. They gave us no chance to prove ourselves. They only killed." His words, bitter and hollow, carried the truth that every pilot knew deep down. The Corsair had rewritten the script. Skies once filled with swirling dogfights now became stages for slaughter. The Italians lifted off, hopeful, determined. And within minutes they were gone, shot down, scattered, or fleeing low to the sea. The Americans did not linger. They did not boast. They simply climbed back into the clouds, mission complete, leaving wreckage behind. Every encounter repeated the motif: laughter, then silence. Pride, then ruin. A bent wing shape on the horizon, and seconds later, a burst of fire, a life extinguished. The climax of perception came not in numbers, not in tactics, but in the crushing weight of inevitability. Italians no longer asked, "Can we defeat them?" They asked only, "When will they find us?" And when a soldier or farmer on the ground heard the deep growl of the Corsair overhead, they did not look up with curiosity. They froze. Because that sound meant only one thing: the sky was no longer theirs. In those final months, Italian air power collapsed entirely. Not through one decisive battle, not through a single catastrophic loss, but through 1,000 encounters, each one a nail hammered by Corsair guns into the coffin of resistance. The bent-wing fighter had become the embodiment of Allied superiority. Its roar was the sound of inevitability. Its tracers were the handwriting of history across the skies. And its presence, more than bombs, more than artillery, told the Italians the truth they could not escape. The war was lost. Short sentences now. Sure. Brutal. They laughed. The Corsair rose. They mocked. The Corsair killed. In seconds their world turned upside down. That is the climax of this story. Not just the fall of machines but the collapse of perception itself. The mocking laughter of 1943 replaced by silence, fear, and the knowledge that arrogance is the deadliest enemy of all. The laughter had faded. The skies over Italy had gone quiet, save for the thunder of Allied engines. For the Italian pilots who had survived, the war was not just lost, it was over before they ever realized it. The Corsair had done more than shred metal. It had shredded illusions. This was the deeper truth. Wars are not only contests of weapons but of perceptions. The Corsair's arrival in Europe was not marked by a single decisive battle, but by a slow, relentless erosion of enemy confidence. Each encounter chipped away at pride, until there was nothing left to fight for. Italian airfields in 1944 told the story in their silence. Hangars that once roared with the energy of young men preparing for combat now echoed only with the sound of tools clattering on concrete. Mechanics patched together machines with no spare parts. Pilots walked slowly to their aircraft, heads bowed, knowing they could not win. And in the midst of this decline, the Corsair remained what it had always been. Ugly to some eyes, awkward on the ground, but in the air, a predator without rival. The lesson was plain: appearances deceive but performance never lies. One might ask, why dwell on this episode of the war when so many others hold more fame? Why focus on a handful of duels between Italian fighters and an American design better remembered for the Pacific? Because here, in this narrow slice of history, lies a universal pattern. The enemy laughed, and then learned the cost of underestimation. The Corsair story is not just about machines, but about human arrogance, resilience, and adaptation. And it is a story that still resonates today. Every generation faces its own Corsair moment. The arrival of something new, unexpected, and ridiculed at first sight. It might be a weapon, a technology, or an idea. The world laughs. And then, suddenly, the world learns. That is why this history matters. It is not about bent wings and .50 caliber guns alone. It is about the timeless truth that dismissing the unfamiliar can be fatal. Now, as we bring this long journey to its close, I'd like to pause and invite you, the listener, to keep walking further into stories like this. If the echoes of the Corsair's whistle have captured your imagination, then join us again. Subscribe to this channel not as a formality, but as a commitment to keep exploring the forgotten corners of history together. Because every week we dive into stories just like this one, tales where laughter turns to silence, where the unexpected changes the course of war. And if this episode has gripped you, if you found yourself leaning closer, waiting for the next turn of the story, then give this video a like. Not as a favor, but as a signal that these stories matter, that they deserve to be remembered. History does not survive on its own. We keep it alive. Together. The Corsair's story in Italy ends in silence. The silence of broken squadrons, empty runways, and a war that moved on without them. But its legacy carried forward. The tactics pioneered by its pilots became the foundation of the jet age. Energy fighting. Hit-and-run strikes. The refusal to enter a fair fight. These are doctrines that shape aerial combat to this very day. Think about that for a moment. A machine once ridiculed as ungainly gave birth to the very principles that modern fighter pilots rely upon. And that, perhaps, is the greatest irony of all. The Italians who laughed at the Corsair were right in one sense. It was no beauty. But they were tragically wrong in another. Beauty in war means nothing. Survival means everything. So the next time you see a machine dismissed as too odd, too heavy, or too clumsy, remember the Corsair. Remember the Italian laughter. And remember the silence that followed. Because in the end, that silence is the truest sound of history.